Hey everyone, Digibro here. I've been pretty busy this month working on some very big video projects, which are taking a little while to get done, and in the meantime I've been putting out some smaller videos on the side, but I haven't really had enough time to make a whole lot of those or to produce a ton of content. So I figured I'd just put out some easy little stuff of some little things I find interesting that aren't really worthy of whole videos, but are interesting to me. So I have this huge collection of random ass new type magazines from 2005 and 6 and 7 that a friend gave me, and I've been slowly going through them and trying to see if there's anything fun or worthwhile in them, and I came across this interview from 2007 with Kenji Kamiyama, the guy who wrote and directed all of the Ghost in the Shell standalone complex series, and To Ubukata, who wrote, in the context of this interview, he's talking about his then recent anime series Les Chevaliers d'Eon, but he's also the writer of Psycho Pass 2 and Ghost in the Shell Arise, two shows that are sequels to franchises that I love, that I don't love the sequels themselves. And of course, as you probably know, I have a huge video series on why I don't like Psycho Pass 2 in comparison to Psycho Pass 1. I've also talked about Ghost in the Shell extensively, so this is these two guys pretty interesting to me and pretty relevant topics to my channel, so I was very interested in this interview. Now, of course, interviews, especially in magazines, often don't get into a whole lot of depth, especially because they're kind of short most of the time, and you can't always take everything that the creators say as something really big and important. Sometimes they're just kind of, spitballing ideas off the top of their heads to answer these questions. They're not necessarily representing the entire ethos of what they do. However, there are some quotes in here from these two creators that I thought were really interesting, especially when it comes to understanding the perspective of how Psycho Pass 2 and Ghost in the Shell Arise were approached in comparison to something like Ghost in the Shell standalone complex. So I'm going to read you a section of this interview. I'm going to put it on screen. So this section is called Two Types of Anime Experts. I'm going to use this voice to represent To Ubukata, and this voice to represent Kenji Kamiyama. I know this sounds like it's coming out of nowhere, but do you know that show on TV where they tear down old buildings and build them back up using completely different designs? Yeah, I know the one you mean. So you remember how that designer always shows up, the one they call the expert? Well, I have a pet theory that there are in fact two types of experts in the world. The experts who design homes and the experts who build the homes. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Right. Well, I think of myself as one of the design experts. Sure, I can think up a plan for a house, but what I really wish I could do was roll up my sleeves and build the actual house from the plans. That's the kind of expert I envy. In anime terms, that means the skills to direct a scene on a very detailed level in a way that breathes real life into the characters. I feel like I need to understand that process a whole lot better before I try drawing up more plans. But it takes both types to make a successful production. You can't have one without the other. Man, I couldn't agree more. The big advantage for me in playing the role of both story editor and director is that at any given point in the script, I can stop and immediately figure out how much of the budget one particular line is going to eat up. That's how I am able to stand up and defend some lines with my life during script meetings. But on the other hand, playing both roles means I'm also more likely to limit the scope of production from the get-go. It's something I struggle with on every project, which is why, at this point in my career, I'd really like to develop the ability to come up with plot and setting ideas that aren't based on tallying up the costs by working back from a preconceived notion of how the final presentation should look. I have the opposite problem. I keep thinking up all this crazy stuff, and the project scope gets so out of control, it's not even halfway in the ballpark of being financially doable. So this conversation actually continued from something that these two were saying in an earlier question, but this gives you the broad sense of the idea. To Ubukata considers himself someone who's great at building story containers, as he says earlier in the interview. He sees himself as someone who builds the framework of a story, but isn't as good at filling in the details, whereas Kenji Kamiyama sees himself as the opposite. Now, let's talk about these two creators' best works. To Ubukata's arguably better, or at least more critically acclaimed works, was his earlier stuff like Marduk Scramble and Les Chevaliers d'Eon, stories where he came up with the whole idea of the story, and the execution of those isn't necessarily all that great. Marduk Scramble, I've read the books, and the dialogue's kind of corny, and the ways that scenes play out are kind of corny, but I get where the ideas are coming from, and that's what makes it interesting. Kenji Kamiyama, meanwhile, was working on Ghost in the Shell, which already had the framework of being built from the manga. The original author had already put most of these ideas into the story. What Kamiyama did so beautifully with Standalone Complex was to take the core ideas of the manga, and even some of the stories and their structures, and then retool them to work in animation, and to be part of this bigger, more intricate plot that he came up with that really expanded on the Ghost in the Shell universe and ideas. So then, we get these two creators who both say that they kind of envy the way the other does things, and both of them end up working on the opposite kind of shows. Kenji Kamiyama, after this he did Seirei no Moribito, which I still haven't seen yet, but then after that he did Eden of the East. And Eden of the East is very much a show that has really interesting concepts and ideas. You can tell he was trying to build this container, but it falls apart in the second half because the container doesn't make enough sense. The way the story was built, the idea of the story, that there were these 12 people who were given all this money and they're supposed to try to change the world, it just kind of deflates in the second half of the story, and that's where a lot of its problems come from. When you see the very early part of Eden of the East, it's really the writing and the interesting structure that makes it so compelling at the beginning, the weird way that it presents its ideas, but then those ideas kind of fall apart, and it got me thinking, well, Kenji Kamiyama isn't good at building the plans. He's not good at setting up a universe. He's good at delivering someone else's universe in a better way. And then we get Toa Ubukata, who ends up on the opposite side. He does two shows that are from someone else's framework, Ghost in the Shell and Psycho-Pass, and he tries to fill in the blanks, and they don't come out that well. And I also, what compelled me to make this video wasn't just that interview, but another one. This interview just came out the other day on Anime News Network. It's Toa Ubukata talking about working on Psycho-Pass 2, which I'll be reading off this laptop. It says, "How much freedom did you feel you were given with the Psycho-Pass universe by IG or Gen Urobuchi for Psycho-Pass 2? Well, the work itself is a world without freedom anyways, haha. I was offered the idea of just barely expanding the world, therefore being able to just barely create a sequel. I had both the scenario for the TV series and the film, so it was all about filling in the blanks. Why is that character a certain way? For example, why does Shimotsuki always seem so grumpy? What position or viewpoint does the protagonist reach that will inform their actions in the movie? There are two characters who appear in the movie named Hinakawa and Sugo, so it's like, who are they? I had to write who they were. I filled in a lot of holes, and I had some limits put on me by the production team as to how I could fill those holes. I also thought that if I didn't put other new characters in, things wouldn't make sense. There's a character called Kamui who appears to reveal a flaw in the civil system that shows the system might disappear in the future. Because this was pointed out in Psycho-Pass 2's story, the story of the film is upgraded. Was it a fun creative challenge, or more stressful or frustrating to create a standalone sequel series like that? The time on the production was really short, so it was difficult. However, as much difficulty as I felt, I was able to have meetings with the director, Gen Urobuchi, Nitro Plus, the producer, and others with a sense of tension. I think there was quite a bit of worth in focusing so hard in such a short amount of time. But there really wasn't much time at all, so I was even rewriting scripts during voice recording sessions. It was kind of a crazy way of making scripts. If I say that the experience I had was fun, I think the staff would say something along the lines of, "Don't mess with us, why were you having fun?" I think the feeling of strain in the process was conveyed in the work. I didn't have any leeway. There were lots of scenes where the characters played around in the first season, but we couldn't put that kind of thing in the second season. That was a little bit disappointing. Which I find interesting because that's one of my big complaints about the second series, was that there wasn't enough room for the characters to play around and to show their human side. Do you feel like you were able to accomplish what you wanted with the series? How much did you know about what was going on with the movies? Yes, I knew the contents of the film. I had to work in a way that wouldn't contradict its contents. I'm happy that Shimotsuki fit well into the movie. If she had gotten along well with Akane in Psycho-Pass 2, it wouldn't connect to the film. That was my biggest relief. I was also able to write about how the civil system's control extends overseas, as well as how Akane is making the system evolve, and I was satisfied with that. I had also put in a story element where Kamui has split personalities, but it was very difficult to put that into animation. Director Shiotani did his best with that until the very end. It's an ending that I'm satisfied with. He goes on to talk a bit about Ghost in the Shell Arise, but not really in any way that's relevant to what I'm trying to explain here. So what's interesting about this interview to me is that it clearly shows that Toa Ubukata didn't have a ton of creative freedom when he was writing for Psycho-Pass 2, which isn't that surprising. But the worst part of it is that the film was already there, the story was already out there. So he had to not only come up with a story that fit in with the Psycho-Pass universe that already existed, he had to force the story to make sense when the movie came out. So there had to be a reason for Shimotsuki to be mad at Akane, and so he comes up with this incredibly forced and ham-fisted reason for her to be mad at Akane, and he's working on such a tight schedule that he didn't even have time to help this thing make sense. It's just interesting to me that they would throw Tohu Bukata into something that he so clearly isn't really the guy for. He's said himself that he's more of a big picture guy and not very good at filling in the blanks in an interview in 2007. And here he is being forced to fill in the blanks in an incredibly short time span on Psycho Pass 2. I think all of this shows that Tohu Bukata is not necessarily untalented, it's that his talents may be misappropriated. And of course, this is just me reading deeply into interviews that could be a tiny part of the picture, and maybe I don't have the whole thing. But in my Psycho Pass video, I really sort of attacked Tohu Bukata as someone who didn't seem to understand the setting, or didn't seem to be as talented at writing for that setting. But maybe it's not so much that he's not good at writing for that setting as he is not good at trying to do this particular show in this particular amount of time that they gave him. I mean, rewriting the scripts during voice acting sessions means that he's pretty much working right down to the wire, and God, how even could you? So maybe it's not that surprising that his work on Psycho Pass 2 isn't very good, and maybe it's not really his fault. I'm curious to know if he'll do something better in the future. Of course, I also think that Ghost in the Shell Arise is very lacking, and I think he was given a lot more freedom on that, and he talks about it more energetically, but even that is nowhere near as bad as Psycho Pass 2, so who knows? I just thought this was a really interesting set of interviews to happen upon in direct succession. I literally read that in the magazine and then just happened to see it on Anime News Network, so yeah, interesting stuff. I hope you'll agree, and I hope you'll stick around for more videos. I might do some more little vlogs like this, just because I don't have another substantial video in the works yet. I mean, I have one in the works, but it's not coming out for a while, so enjoy!